Alright, the usual disclaimer. Hologram did send me this pedal. They didn't pay me any money and have no say over what I say. Yada yada, here we go. So this one surprised me. I didn't really vibe with their previous pedal, the Microcosm, for some reasons that this pedal does the same thing in some ways, but for some reason this is really working for me. I'll talk about what I like about it, how I use it, but first, some music. Alright, so the moment I connected with this pedal was messing around one morning making this video. And I was surprised to find how much I loved the way it sounded with tape. This is doing some tape emulation things, or at least it can, and I was surprised that I wanted it after tape. That's a little duplicative. At first I'd imagined this would be great with drum machines, synths, but it's really after tape that I found that I was digging it. It has a lot to do with the compression and the pitch shifting, and so we'll start by getting into how I use it, just my exact settings, and then we'll talk about the functions and some other thoughts on it. This isn't going to be comprehensive. I haven't explored every single possibility. Feel free to hit the comments with that stuff. Alright, so I'm using this at the end of the signal chain on my live set. And that's mostly tape stuff, so we're just going to get this tape loop rolling again. And I'm going to start with the texture module, which is sort of at the end of the chain. I think of it as the mix bus effect. I have it on squash, which is kind of a pumpy, digital sounding compressor. It reminds me of Live's default compressor, which I use all the time. Brings out the noise, brings out the percussive elements a little bit. Super nice. Next up, the first module, character. I have it on sweeten, which also compresses a bit and does a bit of a smile EQ, which you can kind of tilt to the brighter side or the darker side. We'll go a little brighter right now. Oh, gotta turn those off. Alright, next up, movement. I have it on pitch, which I'll turn all the way up, and you can hear that just popped down an octave. But you can select by half steps. It's a granular pitch shifter, and I feel like it does a good job, especially down low. That sounds great to me. The low frequency stuff is really well intact. The high frequency stuff still sounds good and not too granular. I feel like you can hear the granulation up here very much. But down here it sounds really organic actually. So I leave it there. Next up, I use what's called reverse, which is just reversing it, and also has a bit of a like pumping quality, sidechainy sort of thing I'll talk about later. And it's also pitch shifted. And again, I have it down an octave. So when I combine the two, I can actually pop down 2 octaves. It sounds really nice. Alright, so those are my settings, but I use this. If you hit these 2 buttons, you go into record mode. It's recording your knob motions. So for example, you can see that just turned red. It's recording what I'm doing here. So now you can see that's moving, indicating that it's replaying what I did. I'm going to loop another one. So now they're both going. And when you record them, it loops instantly, and it loops the length of each individual loop. So they're asynchronous, which is great. It keeps things feeling really alive and unpredictable. And that's basically it. That's how I'm using it. I'm not really using the reverbs or delays. We'll talk about those. They're actually really good. But this is what I do with it, an option to pop everything down an octave or two and add a little compression, a little bit of EQ at the end of the chain, and I really like what it does. So the thing about this pedal that surprised me that I liked was how hand-holdy it is. They do put some guardrails on you, but I find them actually to be pretty helpful in certain situations. So for example, I have everything zeroed out here. So we're basically just hearing the dry sound. And I'm going to turn it all the way up. And you can hear that it doesn't clip at all, which I think they have to be compressing or limiting at the input stage before things even get to the effects. As you can feel, the noise came up, but the piano notes aren't clipping. I'll bring it back down. You can hear it gets less compressy. So they're really doing a lot to keep your dynamic range kind of in a safe zone on the way in. And then likewise, throughout all of these effects, they continue to keep your dynamic range in a very safe zone, which when you have distortions combining with delays that can feed back, if you had just a lineup of pedals doing those general things, the dynamics can get really out of control really easily. And they've done a lot to keep things controlled, which is cool. It's also limiting. So in a way, it makes this pedal great for plug and play, but it doesn't give you as nearly granular control as, say, the Electron Heat Plus Effects or something like that, where you can do so much more, but also it's a lot easier to get into territory you don't mean to. All right, so let's dive into all of its functions, or at least a bunch of them. Again, things are zeroed out. Let's start with this first module with drive. All the way up. Some distortion. I'll make it bright. I'll make it dark. Next up, sweeten. Again, all the way up. This is the one I use the most. Doesn't distort as much. Does add a little smiley cue. Next up, fuzz. Next up, howl. And finally, swell, which I think interacts with your input level in a very particular way that I probably would have had to calibrate this more ahead of time to really get that going. Anyway, so the distortions on this unit I would say are the least interesting aspect of it. I'm glad they're there. They can be helpful in creating an overall signal chain, but I wouldn't pick this up for distortion itself. Something like the analog heat is much better for that. All right, let's go with the next module. It's called movement. We'll start with the first one. Doubler, here we go. Nice stereo separation. That's probably most interesting as a subtle thing. I honestly wouldn't use that much, but I could see that being nice on a synth maybe, in a mix. All right, next up, vibrato. That's pretty great. Nice pitch modulation. Yeah, I can see that being really useful. All right, phaser. I never use phasers. That might just be me. I feel like they're a guitar thing, maybe? Or I guess if you want like a super 70s synth tone, it could be nice. All right, next up, tremolo. I know I'm going through these pretty quick. That's hip. And finally pitch, which like we talked about is the one I use. Could be really great as a harmonizer. A little bit of a delay there, but not too bad. All right, next up, the next module, diffusion. We'll start with cascade. That's a delay. So this is a great example of the hand-holding they do here. Getting a delay to fully feed back like this would normally send you into insanity, but it just stays perfectly in the mix. It doesn't overpower things, which might not be what you want, because that is definitely limiting where this can take you creatively. It's not nearly as expressive a delay as many others, and certainly not as unique. But in the context of all these other options, nice to have it. Next one's similar. I'll get its feedback. And a little more sober approach. Sounds nice. I think that one's supposed to be kind of a tape delay. All right, next up, space, which is the reverb. It's nice. It's real basic. You don't have a lot of options here. It reminds me of the microcosm reverb, which was actually my favorite aspect of that pedal. I find this particularly fun to modulate. I use the knob record. Next up, collage. I don't really know what this one's doing. Somebody will tell me in the comments, I'm sure. Some sort of glitchy delay. And then finally reverse, which, as we said, is the one I use the most. That just sounds great. I love that. Compress it a bit. I love slowing things down, and this pedal is just a master at it. Okay, so that's all of those, and now the texture bus, or I think of it as the mix bus, the texture module. Start with filter. Gives you a low pass filter on the left and a high pass filter on the right. Nice to have, pretty limited, but they fit a lot of filtering optionality in just one setting, which is kind of cool. But again, to compare this to the analog heat, the filter there is analog, sounds much better, and you can do a whole lot more with it. But in terms of ease of use, this is kind of unbeatable. All right, squash is what I use the most. Super nice on tape. Cassette, kind of silly on tape for obvious reasons, but I actually kind of like it. That mix of actual tape and fake tape can be kind of good, actually. That's pretty cool. Yeah, I can find uses for this. Broken. Don't know exactly what this one is doing. It kind of sounds just more tapey. And finally, interference, which is glitchy. Kind of reminds me of microcosm. So it's interesting, with the tone of this, which like I said is very digital and keeps your dynamic range very compressed, I don't know if compressed is the right word, keeps it very in control. The sounds you end up getting out of this feel very DAW-like to me. They feel like they're ready to go straight into your DAW and into a mix and will work really well. It feels like everything is safe, which got me thinking about sort of the difference oftentimes between where my brain is at, working over here with hardware devices versus being over to the left here where my computer is set up, working in a DAW. I kind of didn't realize it till I started messing around with this pedal, how my ears go into different zones in each place. This pedal feels so DAW-like over here in the wrong place. It's like out of context, that it kind of struck me as strange at first. Now that I'm using it and that I've used it in actual mixes, I find that actually it fits really well into a mix, but at first it felt so boxy and limited versus working with more analog stuff or just other pedals in general that aren't as hand-holdy. I find that I expect in a way that sort of like super dynamic, out of control thing over here when I'm working with hardware and not over here. So in a way, I feel like that's sort of the defining factor of this thing, actually, in that it's taking things from a pedal environment or hardware environment into a much more DAW-like zone. So like I said, that's turned out to be really useful for me at the end of my live performance chain, because it is at that point that I want to get things kind of ready to be in that sort of final mix zone. And this does a nice job at preparing the sound for that while also giving you some creative options that are going to stay safely in that zone. Anyway, that's basically how I use the pedal and a quick overview of the sounds it can make. Hit me in the comments with your thoughts and questions, what you like about it, what you don't. Thanks for checking out the video.